I was 3 minutes away from signing a contract that could change my life when I found out the man I loved was sleeping with my best friend. The email came through just as I was walking into the publisher's office. Not from him. Not from her. From someone I didn't know, an anonymous sender with no subject line. I almost deleted it, but something made me pause. The body of the message was 2 lines. You deserve to know. They've been lying to you. Start with the hotel receipts. Attached, screenshots. Dozens of them. Dates, check-ins, late-night room service bills. Her name. His. Their room. I stopped in the hallway. My hands shook, not out of shock, but out of clarity. Everything I'd been ignoring crystallized. Zach always had reasons to stay late. Haley always had explanations when she accidentally didn't show up to support me. The missed calls. The shifting stories. They weren't clumsy lies. They were coordinated silence. I stared at the screen for 5 full seconds before I hit archive. Not delete. Archive. Then I pushed open the office door and smiled like nothing happened. They signed me that day. A 2-book deal. National tour. Syndication potential. I was supposed to be happy. But as soon as I stepped outside, I turned off my phone and got on the next train out of New York. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. Not my agent. Not my parents. Especially not Zach. I stayed silent for 9 months. In that time, they tried everything. Emails, voicemails, even Haley's fake wellness check through the police when I wouldn't respond. I watched it all unfold from a borrowed apartment in Chicago, working under a pseudonym, serving coffee by day and sketching by night. What they didn't know is that the book I was working on wasn't the one I'd pitched. It wasn't about art or love or any of the palatable things publishers wanted from me. It was about betrayal, power, control. It was about them. Not in a direct, name and shame way. I wasn't giving them that satisfaction. But every lie they'd told, every moment I doubted myself because of them, I poured into each page. The heroine wasn't soft. She didn't cry quietly. She set the table on fire and walked away without a sound. I published it anonymously through a small press under the name A.J. Vale. No author photo. No biography. Just a short note on the back jacket. This story is for anyone who's ever had the truth ripped from their mouth before they got the chance to speak it. It took off faster than any of us expected. A blog picked it up. Then TikTok. Then a segment on NPR. People messaged the press begging to know who the author was. Book clubs started whole threads analyzing whether the story was based on real events. I stayed silent through all of it, until the publisher invited me to speak at a live panel in San Francisco. That's when I decided to stop hiding. I never planned to see them again. But when Zach found out I'd be in town, he showed up. So did Haley. The nerve. They stood outside the venue, all apologetic stares and soft voices. We didn't know you'd taken it that hard. You disappeared on us. We were worried. I let them talk. Then I walked past them, straight onto the stage. There's something about betrayal that people don't understand until they've felt it. It's not the knife. It's the silence that follows. It's the days you spend trying to figure out if you did something to deserve it. But that day, in front of hundreds of strangers and 2 very familiar faces, I said it out loud. I didn't vanish. I reclaimed what was mine. The room went still. Cameras clicked. I knew they'd be watching. But I wasn't performing. I wasn't asking to be understood. I was setting the story straight. And it was only the beginning. I thought going public would be the end of it. I thought telling the truth would close the door, seal it shut, and let me move forward. I was wrong. Truth doesn't end stories. It ignites them. 2 days after the panel, I woke up to 317 unread messages. Not from Zach. Not from Haley. From people I'd never met. Some wrote paragraphs. Others just 1 sentence. Thank you for saying it out loud. They did that to me too. Now I don't feel crazy. I should have felt proud. Empowered. I felt exposed. The worst part wasn't the attention. It was how fast Zach and Haley flipped the script. Suddenly, they were the victims. They told mutual friends I'd exaggerated everything. That I was turning private pain into performance. They didn't deny the affair. That would have been too easy to disprove. Instead, they reframed it. It was complicated. We never meant to hurt her. She's clearly still not okay. The subtle kind of character assassination, the kind that can't be traced to one quote but spreads like mold. I tried not to care. But when a podcast host messaged me saying Zach had agreed to an interview to share his side, something snapped. His side? His side? The night before the podcast aired, I booked a room under a different name and sat in silence, waiting for the episode to drop. I didn't want to listen. But I had to. It was worse than I expected. He used every tactic in the book: gentle voice, humble pauses, just enough self-blame to look evolved. I hurt someone I cared about. But I also think we need to talk about how pain turns into revenge. There it was. The word. Revenge. As if telling the truth was some sort of vendetta. As if surviving meant I was out for blood. Haley didn't appear on the show, but she posted a long thread the same morning. A carefully worded piece on female friendship, betrayal, and forgiveness. It ended with a photo of her holding a copy of my book. No hate. Just healing. She turned my story into a PR opportunity. Again. I didn't respond. Not right away. I waited. Not out of strategy. Out of self-respect. Because I'd spent too many years reacting instead of deciding. But I wasn't going to let them build a stage out of my silence. A week later, I requested a live interview. No pre-questions. No edits. 1 hour. Raw. The host hesitated, then agreed. I didn't practice. I didn't write notes. I walked into the studio with only one goal: clarity. When the red light blinked on, I looked directly into the camera and said, "This isn't about a relationship. It's about erasure. It's about being rewritten by the people who should have protected you." I told them what they hadn't heard in the book. How Zach used to call me overly sensitive anytime I voiced concern. How Haley would twist my words into punchlines at parties, always with a laugh that sounded too forced. I didn't yell. I didn't accuse. I just laid the truth out in clean lines, sharp and unshakable. The host leaned forward. "And what do you want from all this?" I didn't blink. "Nothing. That's the point. I'm not asking for permission anymore." The interview went viral. But not in the way I expected. It wasn't the scandal people reacted to. It was the calm. The composure. The refusal to flinch. Suddenly, people weren't talking about Zach and Haley. They were talking about every woman who'd ever been told she was imagining things. Then something strange happened. One of the podcast's producers emailed me. She used to work with Zach on a campaign 2 years ago. Said he was incredible at shifting narratives. Said he once helped a public figure scrub a legal allegation just by repackaging the timeline. She ended with one line. "He's done this before. Just not to someone willing to speak." I sat with that for a long time. Not out of shock, but out of confirmation. Because deep down, I'd always known. This wasn't just about love. It was about control. And he hated that I'd taken it back. When Haley posted a follow-up Q&A from her sunlit kitchen, crying softly about feeling misunderstood, I didn't engage. When Zach announced he'd be taking a step back from social media to focus on real connections, I said nothing. I didn't have to. Because this time, the story wasn't theirs to manage. The comments said everything. Why does this sound rehearsed? Why is she crying over consequences? He's only stepping back because the lies didn't land. This isn't a happy ending. It's not an ending at all. It's the space where silence used to live, filled now with something louder. Not revenge. Not rage. Just truth. And it echoes. I didn't plan on becoming a symbol. But when people start projecting their own stories onto you, symbols are exactly what you become. It wasn't about Zach and Haley anymore. Not really. It was about every woman who had been told she was too emotional, too dramatic, too unstable to be trusted with her own truth. I didn't want the attention. I wanted accountability. But attention came first. 2 months after the interview, I got an email from a university in Seattle. They were hosting a panel on narrative manipulation, how truth is twisted by those who fear it. They wanted me to headline. I almost said no. I wasn't an expert. I was just someone who stopped apologizing long enough to be heard. But then I remembered something Zach used to say. People only listen when you speak their language. He meant branding, positioning, control. But maybe he was right. Maybe the only way to dismantle a system is to speak louder than it. I accepted. The night before the event, I walked into the auditorium early. Not to rehearse. Just to stand in the space. Quietly. Grounded. And that's when I saw her, one of the panelists, sitting off to the side, scanning notes. She looked familiar, but I couldn't place her until I heard her voice. "You don't remember me, do you?" It clicked. She'd been in the same creative mentorship program I joined years ago, before the book, before the fallout. I remembered how Zach used to mock her writing behind her back. Called it trauma cosplay. I'd laughed once. Quietly. Just to avoid becoming the next target. She hadn't forgotten. "I saw your interview," she said. "Took me 2 weeks to believe it wasn't some rebranding campaign." I nodded. I understood. The hardest part about speaking up isn't the backlash. It's knowing how many people doubted you long before you said a word. The panel went live an hour later. Halfway through, A student asked me what forgiveness looked like. I answered honestly. Forgiveness isn't silence. It's not forgetting. It's not letting someone walk away clean while you stay stained. Forgiveness, if it ever comes, isn't for them. It's for you. So you don't carry their damage like it's part of your identity. Afterward, the student stopped me in the hallway. She told me her mother used to say the same thing, but softer. Quieter. Like she didn't fully believe it. You said it like it's a fact. It is, I said. It just took me a while to believe it, too. The next shift came fast. A small blog published an exposé on Zach's PR firm, former clients detailing how he spun personal controversies into redemption arcs. There were contracts, emails, leaked scripts for podcast appearances that were meant to sound spontaneous. One paragraph stood out. He helped men cry strategically and women apologize publicly, all while maintaining control of the narrative. The blog didn't mention Haley by name, but readers connected the dots. For the first time, I didn't have to explain anything. People saw it themselves. Then came the email from Haley. Subject line, please read. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't even deny anything. She just asked me to meet. Off the record. No photos. No statements. I said yes. Not because I wanted to hear her out. Because I wanted to see if she still believed her version. We met in a public park. No hugs. No fake smiles. She started with a sigh, like the weight of the past belonged equally to both of us. I didn't think you'd agree to come. You didn't think I'd speak either, I said. She looked down. Then up. I was jealous. That's the truth. You were talented, and I was scared. Zach, he saw that in you, and I let him twist it. She paused. He twisted me, too. I wanted to believe that. But I also knew it wasn't the full truth. People can be victims and participants at the same time. She had made choices. Not just once. Repeatedly. Willingly. I'm not here to redeem you, I said. I'm not your alibi. She nodded slowly. I know. I just needed to say it to your face. That it happened. That I did it. It wasn't an apology. It was a record correction. And I took it for what it was. After that, I didn't hear from her again. Zach, however, sent a cease and desist. Apparently, someone leaked his old client scripts to a journalist. He blamed me. This is defamation, the letter said. Cease all defamatory commentary. But I hadn't said anything new. The damage wasn't in my words. It was in theirs. 2 weeks later, the publisher of my original 2-book deal reached out. They wanted to reissue my debut novel, this time with my real name. I said no. That book belonged to a version of me that still asked for permission. Still softened her edges to fit expectations. But I offered them something else. A new manuscript. About control. About narrative. About truth spoken plainly. They accepted it within 2 days. The final chapter hadn't been written. But I knew now that I'd never let anyone else hold the pen again. I used to think that reclaiming your voice meant telling your side louder than theirs. I don't believe that anymore. Because real power isn't in being louder. It's in not needing to explain it all. 6 months passed. The manuscript I submitted was now in production, and the publisher didn't ask me to soften a single word. No edits for tone. No notes about likability. That was new. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt still. Zach had gone mostly silent. Haley had disappeared from social media. The podcast that once featured them ran a quiet correction on its website. We've removed the interview from our archives at the guest's request. No apology. No statement. Just erasure. Which was ironic, considering how hard they'd tried to erase me. I spent more time offline. Not to escape, just to recover. There's a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from being perceived constantly. Every sentence dissected. Every breath repackaged into someone else's moral takeaway. It's a strange thing to go from invisible to seen, only to realize that visibility is its own kind of burden. But I wasn't hiding. I was building. In January, I launched a private mentorship circle for women in creative fields, writers, illustrators, musicians, anyone who had been silenced or sidelined. I didn't advertise it. I didn't tie it to my name. The invitation spread through word of mouth. We met virtually at first, small, focused sessions. No branding. No merch. Just space. They didn't come to be inspired. They came to unlearn the habit of apologizing. One of them, a filmmaker from Vermont, said something I still think about. I don't want to be palatable. I want to be precise. That became the ethos of the entire group. But the past wasn't entirely finished with me. One afternoon, I received a package. No return address. Inside was a handwritten letter. From Zach. It wasn't angry. It wasn't desperate. It was calculated. You've built something impressive, he wrote. I hope one day we can talk, not as enemies, but as people who knew each other deeply before things got complicated. That word again. Complicated. The word people use when they don't want to call their choices what they were. I didn't respond. I didn't burn the letter either. I left it in a drawer. Not for closure, just as proof. A relic of who he still was. Someone who thought saying we could dissolve what he had done. The book launched quietly. No billboard campaigns. No press tour. But it didn't need any of that. It sold out in a week. The reviews came in steadily, people calling it sharp, cold, honest. One critic wrote, "It reads like someone stood up in a courtroom, not to defend themselves, but to name the system." That was exactly what I'd written it for. I didn't need to tell people who it was about. They already knew. At a reading in Minneapolis, a woman in the back raised her hand. If you could go back, before the betrayal, would you warn yourself? Would you change it? It was a question I'd been avoiding for months. No, I said. Because the warning wouldn't have worked. I wasn't ready to hear it. I needed to live through it to see what I couldn't unsee. She nodded slowly. Her hand dropped back to her lap. That's the thing about truth. You can't hand it to someone. You can only show them what it looks like when you stop running from it. Later that night, I got a message from one of the women in the mentorship circle. Her short film, based on her own experience with coercion in the music industry, had been accepted to a major festival. She didn't say thank you. She said, I stopped making myself small. That was the shift. I didn't need recognition. I didn't need revenge. I needed alignment. And I had it now. For the first time in my adult life, there were no scripts to memorize. No damage control. No curated version of myself designed to earn less punishment. Just facts. Just voice. Just space to exist without translation. A year after the original betrayal, I walked past the same office building where I'd almost signed that first publishing contract, the day I found out everything. I didn't go inside. I just stood on the sidewalk, looking up at the windows I used to think led to a different version of my life. I felt nothing. And that was freedom. Some people think survival is about endurance. But survival is really about discernment. Knowing what to carry and what to leave behind without guilt. Zach and Haley weren't my story anymore. They were just the detour that reminded me where not to go. There's a moment after the noise dies down, after the interviews, after the messages, after the last headline fades, where you find yourself asking a question no one warned you about. Now what? You survive the betrayal. You speak your truth. You build something out of the wreckage. But once the dust settles, when the adrenaline's gone and the spotlight moves on, you realize survival wasn't the goal. It was just the threshold. What comes next has to mean more. A year and a half after I disappeared from New York, the university where it all began reached out again. They wanted to start a residency program, one designed for women rebuilding their creative identities after personal or professional trauma. They asked if I'd be the founding mentor. It would mean returning. To the same city, the same circles, some of the same faces. The same streets I once escaped with shaking hands and a mind full of static. I almost declined. Then I asked myself why. I wasn't scared of seeing them again. I wasn't afraid of being dragged back into old stories. What I feared was something quieter, that I'd somehow built all this momentum just to arrive back where I started, emotionally frozen at the same mile marker, just more decorated now. But fear is not a compass. And I'd followed it long enough. I took the role. The residency launched in the spring. 10 women. All from different backgrounds. Pain wasn't their common thread, resistance was. Each one of them had been told, directly or implicitly, that their work was only valid if it could be shaped into something easy to consume. They weren't there to be healed. They were there to stop negotiating their brilliance. One of them, a former academic who left tenure after exposing harassment in her department, said something in our second session that stuck with me. People kept asking why I was willing to burn it all down. I told them because no one handed me matches until I stopped pretending it wasn't already on fire. That was the tone of the program, unapologetic. Not cruel. Not vindictive. Clear. Near the end of the term, the university hosted a public showcase. Our cohort presented their work, essays, short films, spoken word. They asked me to close the evening with a reflection. I hadn't planned anything, but I stepped up to the mic anyway. When I started writing again, I said, it wasn't to be understood. It was to stop disappearing. Some people mistook that for bitterness. But clarity isn't bitterness. It's just inconvenient for the ones who relied on your silence. No applause. Not yet. Just stillness, the good kind. The kind where people are listening without the filter of politeness. Then, as I left the stage, I saw a familiar figure standing by the exit. Haley. She didn't approach me, didn't smile, just watched. I could have walked past her. Instead, I paused a few feet away. Enough distance that nothing could be misunderstood. She spoke first. I came because I thought I owed it to the version of you I used to know. I didn't correct her. She never knew me. She only knew the version I bent into shape to fit her approval. You don't owe me anything, I said. And I don't owe you silence. She nodded once. Not with understanding, just recognition. She didn't ask for forgiveness. That, I think, was the most honest thing she'd done in years. We didn't say goodbye. We just stood there, on opposite sides of a truth that had already outlived both of us. Later that week, I got a call from a journalist who'd followed the story from the beginning. She asked if I had any final thoughts now that things had come full circle. I told her that's not how circles work. There's no clean loop. No perfect ending. We don't land back at the start, we evolve past it. That's the win. Months passed. I kept mentoring. Kept writing. Not about them, not anymore. I wrote about women who rewrote their lives mid-sentence. Who stopped asking how much of themselves they could safely reveal. Who didn't wait for proof to speak. I didn't need closure from Zach. I didn't need Haley's redemption. I didn't even need justice in the traditional sense. I just needed to stop shrinking. And I had. The last time I mentioned either of their names publicly, it wasn't in accusation. It wasn't even personal. It was during a lecture on ownership, how protecting your narrative isn't about revenge, but responsibility. I said, if you let someone else frame your story, you'll spend your life defending context. Control is not about revenge. It's about authorship. And that's what I'd reclaimed. Not just peace. Not fame. Not a moral victory. Authorship. The right to define my own life without waiting for permission. I used to think my voice was something I had to earn. Like credibility came only after being broken enough times to be taken seriously. But now I understand it was never about permission. It was about access. And once I stopped asking for it, everything shifted. The residency I helped launch had grown. What began with 10 women in a borrowed conference room had expanded into a full fellowship program. Not just writers anymore, filmmakers, designers, coders, public speakers. Women who had stories they were told not to tell. Some were young, still recovering from the fallout of their first betrayal. Others had waited decades to find a space where their truth didn't come with conditions. I didn't position myself as a leader. I positioned myself as someone who remembered what it felt like to be silenced, then decided not to live like that anymore. One afternoon, after a roundtable discussion on narrative autonomy, a young designer approached me. She looked focused, not fragile. What do you do when the people who tried to erase you start mimicking your voice? I knew the question well. That's the second betrayal, not when they attack you, but when they realize your power worked and they try to wear it like it's theirs. You see them in interviews, posts, panels, using the language of liberation while still practicing control. Their tone changes, but their tactics don't. You don't chase that, I said. You build forward so fast they can't keep up. I kept writing, not about the betrayal, but what came next. Not survival. Strategy. Not resilience. Redirection. My third book centered on a protagonist who left her high-profile job after being scapegoated for a system-wide failure. She didn't plot revenge. She exposed the mechanisms quietly and rebuilt something so unshakable that even her silence spoke. When it launched, no one asked me if it was based on true events. They knew better. I was invited to speak at a summit in Washington, D.C., a gathering focused on power structures and narrative repair. Most of the room was filled with academics, activists, policy analysts. I didn't fit in by title. But when I spoke, the room didn't blink. When we talk about reclaiming our stories, we forget that the real danger wasn't just the lie. It was the infrastructure that made the lie believable. You could feel the shift. People weren't just nodding, they were recalibrating. After the session, one of the coordinators handed me a list of attendees. A few familiar names stood out. People I hadn't heard from in years. People who once questioned my credibility. Now they were quoting my work. Not because they suddenly respected me, but because the world did. I didn't let that vindicate me. I let it confirm what I already knew. Impact is louder than validation. I wasn't interested in revenge anymore. Not even in poetic justice. What mattered was the chain reaction. Because for every woman who saw herself in my story, another started telling hers, unapologetically. Some louder, some quieter. Some through books, others through boardrooms, courtrooms, classrooms. The point wasn't how. The point was that it happened at all. A year later, we opened a second chapter of the fellowship program in Atlanta. I stood in the back as the newest cohort shared their opening statements. One woman, a playwright who had been blacklisted after refusing to rewrite a sexual harassment scene to make it less real, said something that stopped the room. "I'm not here to tell a softer story. I'm here to tell the one they can edit." That's when I knew the legacy wasn't just mine. It wasn't a brand. It wasn't a movement with my name attached. It was a signal passed from voice to voice, choice to choice. I no longer needed to narrate my pain to prove my presence. I had become evidence that truth, when held firmly, can outrun the lies that once defined us. People still ask if I ever saw Zach again. I didn't. Not directly. But I saw his latest project, a book about rebuilding trust after breakdowns. He'd rebranded again. Clean lines. Polished blurbs. Familiar phrasing, stripped of risk. He wasn't writing to tell the truth. He was writing to manage it. I didn't need to call him out. He had nothing left to take from me. And Haley? Last I heard, she moved to Europe. Started over, again. She teaches workshops now on radical honesty. I don't laugh at the irony. I just recognize the pattern. Some people learn. Some people adjust. But it's not my job to track who's who anymore. That's the freedom I earned. The final chapter wasn't about closing a loop. It was about building a foundation, firm enough to hold others, steady enough not to collapse under scrutiny. I no longer felt haunted. I felt anchored. Not in a story of betrayal, but in what came after it. Choice. Direction. Leadership. And if there's anything I've learned, anything worth passing forward, it's this. You don't have to destroy anyone to win. You just have to stop letting them narrate you. That's how you rewrite a life. That's how the silence finally ends. The stories that last aren't the ones shouted the loudest. They're the ones that echo quietly, consistently, long after you've stopped telling them. I didn't expect mine to echo this far. It was a fall afternoon when the email came in from the editorial team at a global storytelling summit based in Geneva. They were curating a segment called Narratives That Shift Culture, and they wanted me to speak. Not about the betrayal, not even about the books, about the framework I developed for rebuilding personal narrative after manipulation. They didn't ask me to relive anything. They asked me to explain what came after. That was rare. So I said yes. At the summit, the audience wasn't made up of victims. It was leaders, CEOs, educators, founders. Most of them had no idea what it felt like to be gaslit out of your own story, but they held influence over systems that made it possible. And so, I spoke their language. Not through slogans or metaphors, but with precision. The problem isn't that people lie. It's that we've normalized narratives built by the loudest, not the most honest. Rebuilding personal narrative isn't just recovery, it's resistance. Silence followed. Not hesitation, attention. These weren't people who gave their focus easily. But they stayed with me. Afterward, one woman approached. She ran a foundation for youth media literacy and had read my second book in a college course she once taught. Her students had debated whether I had gone too far in revealing real dynamics in fictional form. They kept asking if your story was a warning or a weapon. I smiled. It was a mirror. They just weren't ready to see who was in it. Back home, I found the mentorship program growing faster than we could structure it. Alumni had started their own local chapters. I stopped being the center of it, and that was exactly the goal. I didn't need to lead anymore. I just needed to make sure the system didn't return to silence once I stepped aside. One of the fellows, an investigative journalist from New Mexico, had uncovered a network of systemic NDAs used to bury misconduct at an arts nonprofit. Her story, backed by documentation and testimony, led to resignations and funding freezes. She didn't frame it as revenge. She framed it as record correction. She said something during our last check-in I still think about. It's not that people didn't care before. It's that they didn't believe we'd speak clearly enough to be undeniable. Meanwhile, I kept writing. My latest project wasn't a book. It was a digital archive, one that collected anonymous stories from women who'd had their narratives manipulated, reframed, or stolen. Not to expose individuals, but to show the pattern. There were thousands of submissions within the first month. Some were just a sentence. He said I imagined it. She called it a phase. They said I should be grateful. Others were pages-long stories never spoken aloud before. Not out of shame, but exhaustion. We reviewed each one manually. No AI filters. No curation for drama. Just people finally speaking without asking if it was too much. We called it the ledger. Not a confessional. A record. I was invited to discuss it on a panel in New York, the same city I'd left without warning years ago. This time, I walked in differently. Not guarded. Not defiant. Just clear. After my talk, a young woman stood during the Q&A. She didn't have a question. She had a statement. I used to think you were being dramatic. I followed everything. I judged you. Then it happened to me. The room went still. Not from discomfort, from recognition. I didn't believe your story until it became my own. She sat down. I didn't respond. I didn't need to, because that moment wasn't about me. It was about the shift, when someone goes from questioning your voice to hearing their own in it. One night, while preparing a set of closing notes for a writing cohort, I received a message request on social media. I hadn't checked that inbox in a long time. It was from a man I didn't recognize immediately, but his name was tied to one of the early podcast episodes Zach appeared on, the one that had framed me as unstable, reactive, unreliable. He didn't apologize. He just wrote, "You were right. We didn't ask the right questions." I closed the app. Not because I was angry, but because I wasn't interested in retroactive belief. Belief, when convenient, is just damage control. Eventually, I stopped talking about Zach or Haley at all. Not because I forgave them, but because they stopped being relevant. They'd become background noise to a much larger conversation. The betrayal no longer defined the story. The aftermath did. And the aftermath belonged entirely to me. I often think back to the girl I used to be, the one who bit her tongue so hard it bruised just to keep peace. If she saw me now, she might not recognize my voice. Not because it changed, but because I'd finally stopped whispering.